The station was nearly empty, the dust carrying whispers of every cruel word she had heard in her 50 years. Too big to marry, too plain to be chosen. They said it often enough that she began to believe it herself. And when the stagecoach doors slammed shut, leaving her standing alone with nothing but her battered suitcase, even the air felt heavy with rejection. But that wasn't the end of her story. It was only the beginning. Because what the world had dismissed, what neighbors mocked, what family abandoned, someone else saw differently. From across the platform, a cowboy with weathered hands and eyes that had known too much loneliness paused. He didn't see a woman too big. He saw someone too rare to lose. And in that single glance, everything began to change. Most people missed it. They were too busy laughing, too busy whispering. They didn't notice the strength it took for her to keep her head high, the quiet dignity that still lived inside her heart, or the way she refused to give up on kindness, even when kindness had so often been denied to her. But he noticed, and he didn't just notice, he stepped forward. That moment could have been small, forgettable, but instead it set off a chain of choices that would test them both. Because love in the Wild West was never simple, never easy, and never safe from the eyes of those who judge. What began with a single act of courage, a cowboy daring to claim her, not out of pity, but out of truth, would unravel years of pain and awaken a hope neither of them thought they would feel again. This is not just a story about romance. It's about scars that finally find healing, about shame that turns into strength, and about love, arriving not in the bright spring of youth, but in the quiet, unexpected twilight of life. So stay with me until the very end. Because hidden in this story is not only what happened that night, the secret that turned his life upside down, but also a reminder that sometimes the very thing the world calls worthless is what makes you priceless. The train screeched to a halt at the small prairie station, its iron wheels hissing like a beast unwilling to rest. Dust swirled across the platform, carrying with it laughter, hurried footsteps, and the impatient chatter of townsfolk. And there amidst the noise stood Clara. She clutched her carpetbag tightly, the faded leather, worn smooth from too many journeys, too many places where she was never meant to stay. At 50, her face carried the softness of a woman who had endured not the sharp edges of one untouched by pain. Her body, fuller than most, had become the target of whispers and cruel jokes. Too big to marry, they had said, as if a woman's worth could be measured by the width of her waist or the shape of her hips. She heard the voices now, young women in bonnets giggling behind their gloved hands, men shaking their heads with pity or disdain. Their words didn't need to be spoken aloud. Their eyes screamed enough. Yet Clara kept her chin steady, the way a tree withstands windstorms, not because it is untouched, but because it has grown deep roots. Her life had been a tapestry of rejection, forced proposals she had resisted, betrayals she had endured, and a marriage that ended in abandonment. She had been called a burden, a punishment, even an embarrassment, and yet she remained gentle. She still baked bread for her neighbors, still prayed over the sick, still carried dignity like a fragile lantern through the darkness. But on that platform, dignity felt thin. Loneliness pressed against her chest, heavy as the prairie sky before rain. She had come here under the promise of a new life, a marriage arranged perhaps not by love, but by necessity. Yet no one stepped forward to claim her. The minutes stretched long, and her heart began to whisper the same cruel refrain she had heard for years. No one wants you. You are too much and never enough. Then through the blur of shame and dust, she noticed a figure leaning quietly against the post by the station fence. Thomas. His hat shaded his eyes, but his posture was different from the others, still steady without judgment. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't turning away. He was simply watching, as though he saw not the weight of her body, but the weight of her story. And for the first time in a long while, Clara felt something stir beneath her sorrow. Not hope, at least not yet, but the faintest flicker of possibility, like the first star that dares appear before the night fully arrives. Would Thomas step forward? Would the cruel whispers define her future? Or would something softer take root in this hard western soil? The platform slowly emptied as families reunited and strangers departed in carriages. Clara remained, her carpetbag at her feet, her hands clasped too tightly in her lap. The man who was supposed to meet her, a rancher whose letters had been short and businesslike, never came. The promise of a new start vanished with the last wagon wheels rolling away. She was alone. Again. The townsfolk's voices lingered in the air, sharp as cactus spines. She looks like a punishment, not a wife. Who'd feed a woman like that on a poor ranch? The cruelty wasn't new to her ears, but each barb landed just the same. She pulled her shawl tighter, not for warmth, but as a thin shield against their stares. And then footsteps. Thomas approached with the slow, deliberate gait of a man who had seen too many storms to rush. His boots crunched against the wooden planks, steady, unhurried. When he stopped before her, Clara didn't dare lift her gaze. She expected pity. She braced herself for mockery. Instead, she heard only his voice, low, calm, carrying a kind of gentleness that felt out of place in such a harsh world. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat, "looks like someone forgot to claim what's precious." Her breath caught. Precious? The word was foreign, almost unbelievable, after years of being called everything but. She finally looked up, meeting his eyes. They were not the sharp, assessing eyes of men who weighed worth like cattle at auction. They were warm-lined by sun and sorrow, the eyes of someone who understood loneliness too well. I I think they changed their mind," Clara whispered, her voice shaking. "Then they're fools," he replied simply. The words settled over her like rain on parched earth. He didn't reach for her hand, didn't offer false promises. He only stood there steady as the land itself, giving her space to breathe. Around them, the last of the crowd dispersed. Yet for Clara, it felt as if the entire world had narrowed to this moment, one man's refusal to look away. She couldn't know yet whether this was the beginning of kindness or another fleeting gesture that would dissolve into nothing. But in Thomas's gaze, she saw something she hadn't seen in years: recognition, not of her size or her age or her shame, but of her humanity. Could she dare believe this man meant what he said? Or was it another kindness that would vanish like smoke in the wind? Clara followed Thomas through the narrow streets, her carpet bag clutched tight against her chest. He hadn't offered his arm nor tried to take her bag. His respect was its own kind of courtesy. Still, every step felt like borrowed ground, as if at any moment he would change his mind and turn her away like the rest. They passed by shop fronts where women paused in their sweeping to stare, whispers trailing like dust behind them. "There goes the widow." Imagine being desperate enough to take her in. Their words were sharp, but it was the looks, those sidelong glances of pity mixed with mockery, that made Clara's stomach knot. Inside her, the old voices rose louder than the townsfolk's, the voices of her past. "No man will ever want you. You're too much to feed, too little to keep. Better you stay invisible." Her steps faltered. Thomas noticed. He slowed, turning slightly to meet her eyes. "You all right?" Clara nodded quickly, too quickly. "Yes, I just—" Her voice trailed off. What could she say that her heart was torn between wanting to believe in his kindness and fearing it was just another cruel joke? When they reached his wagon, he lifted her bag onto the back. "It's a long ride to the ranch," he said softly. "I don't promise it'll be easy, but it'll be honest. That much I can give." Honest. The word lingered. Clara had lived too long in shadows of half-truth and broken promises. Yet even as a flicker of hope stirred, doubt pressed harder. Why would this man choose her? Why, when the world had made it clear she was unworthy? On the ride out of town, the prairie stretched wide and golden before them, endless and silent. Clara sat rigid on the bench, her hands folded tightly in her lap, afraid to let them tremble. She wanted to ask him why. She wanted to demand what he saw in her, but fear sealed her lips. Instead, she asked the safer question. "Why were you at the station?" Thomas kept his eyes on the road. "I make trips to town every few weeks. Sell feed, pick up supplies. That's all. And yet you stop for me." "I reckon some things are too important to pass by," he answered simply. His words should have warmed her, but they tore at her too. Hope was dangerous. It had betrayed her before. Her heart wrestled with itself, one side whispering that maybe, just maybe, this was real, and the other reminding her that no kindness had ever lasted. As the wagon rolled on, Clara looked out at the horizon. The sky was wide, the land merciless, but somewhere in that vastness lay the possibility of a different life. For the first time in years, she felt the tug of war inside her soul, between fear and trust, despair and hope. Would Clara's doubt smother the fragile light of kindness Thomas offered, or could she dare to let it grow? The prairie seemed endless, as the wagon rattled forward, the wooden wheels creaking like weary bones. Clara sat rigid on the bench, her eyes fixed on the horizon, where sky and land blurred into one lonely line. Every bump in the road sent her heart tumbling in the same rhythm and uneven beat of hope and dread. She tried not to glance at Thomas beside her, but she couldn't help herself. His hands gripped the reins with the ease of a man born to the saddle, yet there was a gentleness in the way he clicked his tongue, guiding the horses as though they were old friends. He said little, and silence stretched between them, thick as the summer heat. Clara's mind was not silent, though. It was a storm. Why did he stop for me? How long until he changes his mind? How long until I am cast out again? She had lived too many years in the company of rejection. Every time she dared to hope, the world had pressed her down, mocking her body, mocking her worth. The laughter of men, the cruel eyes of women, those were scars no one could see, yet they ached more than any wound of flesh. The horses slowed as the wagon climbed a low hill. At the crest, the land opened into a wide valley. Clara drew in a breath. Before them lay a homestead, not large but standing proud against the sweep of grassland. A modest ranch house, a weathered barn, fences mended with care. Smoke rose from a chimney as if the house itself was breathing alive, waiting. "This is it," Thomas said, his voice quiet. "Home. Home." The word twisted inside her chest. She had not called any place that in decades. Even the house of her childhood had never offered comfort, only duty and silence. Could this place she had never seen truly be home? The wagon rolled into the yard. Chickens scattered, clucking indignantly. A dog barked once, and then, sensing its master, wagged its tail. Thomas hopped down and offered a hand to Clara. She hesitated, the ghosts of ridicule whispering, "He'll drop you. He'll laugh at your weight. He'll see how heavy you really are." But Thomas did not laugh. He waited steady as a post in the earth, his hand open. With trembling fingers, Clara placed her own into his. His grip was warm, firm. He steadied her as she stepped down, as though her dignity mattered. For a flicker of a moment, she felt something she had nearly forgotten: respect. Inside the house, it was plain but clean. Worn wooden floors, curtains faded by sunlight, a kitchen table scarred with years of meals and memories. Clara's eyes swept across the room, taking in its simplicity. She had expected grandeur, or perhaps chaos. But no, this was a place shaped by careful hands, by honest work. Thomas set her bag near the door. "You'll take the back room. Fresh linens are on the bed. It ain't much, but it's yours." Yours. Another word that pierced her heart. She had belonged to no one, nothing for so long. To hear that even a small room was hers was almost too much. That night she sat on the edge of the narrow bed, her hands folded in her lap. The silence of the house pressed in, not cruel, but heavy. Thomas moved quietly in the next room, his boots on the floorboards, the faint sound of water in a basin. Ordinary sounds of a man living a life. Yet to Clara they felt foreign. Her mind whispered again, "Don't trust this. Don't trust him. Nothing good lasts." But her heart whispered back, softer yet stubborn, "Perhaps this time is different." The days that followed were both balm and torment. Thomas did not treat her as a burden. He did not order her about nor ignore her. Instead, he worked the land from dawn to dusk, and when he returned, his nod or brief smile carried more kindness than any man had ever given her. He never commented on her size, never mocked her clumsy steps in the barn. If he noticed the way her hands trembled when she tried to cook again after years of neglect, he said nothing. But silence can cut as sharp as cruelty. One evening, after mending fence posts together, Clara found herself staring at him across the kitchen table. He ate slowly, weary from labor, yet peaceful. She wanted to ask him, "Why me? Why choose me? When you could have walked past, left me at that station to rot like the others wanted." The question burned her tongue, but fear sealed it. Instead, she asked something safer. "Do you always work alone?" Thomas wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Been that way since my brother passed. Neighbors help when needed, but mostly it's just me." His eyes held no pity when they looked at her, only truth, plain and steady. And for the first time, Clara wondered if loneliness had carved him hollow, the same way it had hollowed her. That night when she lay down, she stared at the ceiling until moonlight spilled across the boards. A thought formed, fragile and frightening. Perhaps we are both broken in ways the world can't see, and perhaps together the cracks might not feel so wide. Yet doubt never sleeps long. A week later, Thomas suggested she ride into town with him. Clara's stomach turned to ice. She remembered too vividly the laughter, the sneers, the way women had turned their heads at the station. To show her face beside him in broad daylight felt like inviting fresh humiliation. "I'd rather stay," she whispered. "You've as much right to town as anyone," Thomas said gently. His words were kind, but they stung. Right? No, she thought. She had been denied that right her whole life. The world had made it clear she did not belong. As he drove the wagon away without her, Clara stood on the porch gripping the railing so tightly her knuckles blanched. She hated herself for being afraid, hated the way her chest ached with shame. Inside her, war raged louder than ever. Stay small. Stay hidden. That's how you survive. But he sees you. He treats you as if you matter. It was too much. Too much to hope, too much to bear. Clara sank into the porch chair, her hands covering her face. For the first time since coming to the ranch, she wept not the quiet tears of despair she had shed all her life, but great wrenching sobs of a soul caught between chains and freedom. When Thomas returned at dusk, he said nothing. He simply set the parcels down, walked to her chair, and laid one calloused hand over hers. No words, just presence. And in that presence, Clara felt something stronger than pity, stronger than kindness. She felt chosen. Her heart, though still wounded, began to crack open just enough to let the light in. Would Clara find the courage to step out of her shadows, or would the weight of her past silence her forever? The harvest moon hung over the valley wide and golden, spilling its light across the ranch. Clara stood at the porch rail, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her heart restless. For weeks she had lived in this quiet rhythm, mornings spent in the kitchen, afternoons helping mend or tend the garden, evenings at the table with Thomas. Each day she felt herself softening like earth after rain, and yet her fears still clung to her like burrs. She could not believe she was more than a burden, no matter how gently Thomas treated her. The words of others still echoed, "Too big to marry, too useless, too much." That night, Thomas came outside wiping his hands on a rag. He had been fixing the wagon, but his eyes searched her face as though he knew her silence better than her words. "You've been carrying something heavy," he said simply. Clara swallowed. "I always have." The truth slipped out before she could stop it. Her body trembled, but once the words began, they poured like water from a cracked jar. "I was given away at 16. My father said it was the best he could do for me. Marry me off to a man who never looked at me except to scorn me. I cooked, I cleaned, I carried his children until my body broke. And when I could bear no more, he left me for someone younger. Since then, every town, every whisper has told me the same. I'm nothing, a mistake, a weight no one should have to carry." Her voice cracked. "And then you stopped at that station. You said I was yours. Why, Thomas? Why me?" Silence stretched, broken only by the crickets and the faint rustle of grass in the night wind. Thomas stepped closer, his presence steady as the oak trees behind the barn. His voice was low, rough with honesty. "Because I know what it is to be thrown aside. I buried my wife 10 years ago. Folks said I was better off, that a man's work was all he needed. But I knew what it was to wake to an empty house, to sit at a table where no one waited. Loneliness carves a man hollow, Clara. And when I saw you, I didn't see weight. I saw someone who had carried sorrow as I have. I saw a woman with strength written in her very bones. And I thought if she'd let me, maybe we could carry the weight together." Clara's breath caught. For a moment, the years of cruelty pressed hard, urging her to doubt. But then something shifted inside, like chains loosening. His words were not flattery. They were truth spoken without disguise. She wept not the hopeless weeping of the past, but tears that cleansed, that softened her chest where scars had hardened. Thomas reached out, not to seize, but to offer. His calloused hand hovered, waiting. Slowly trembling, Clara placed her hand in his. For the first time in decades, she did not feel ashamed of its size, of its weight. She felt held. The moonlight seemed brighter, the night air lighter. In that moment, something long imprisoned in Clara's soul broke free. She whispered almost to herself, "I am not too much." Thomas squeezed her hand. "No, Clara. You are enough. More than enough." They stood there, silence, wrapping them like a blanket, but it was no longer the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of peace, of two souls finding rest at last. The next morning, Clara woke with a different lightness. She stepped into the kitchen and for the first time in years hummed a tune her mother used to sing. She set bread to rise, stirred a pot of stew, and when Thomas came in from the fields, his brow damp with sweat, she greeted him with a smile that felt strange on her lips. Strange and yet wonderfully right. He paused at the door, startled as though the sight of her smiling was a gift he hadn't expected. And in that pause, Clara realized healing was not some grand event. It was these small moments, the courage to speak truth, the grace to be seen, the choice to hope again. Her shadows had not vanished, but they no longer ruled her. The question now was, could this fragile hope survive the harsh eyes of the world beyond their ranch? Autumn settled slowly across the valley. The fields blushed gold, the air turned crisp, and Clara found herself standing taller each day. Life on the ranch carried a rhythm she had never known before, a rhythm not of survival alone, but of belonging. She and Thomas worked side by side, mending fences, tending to the livestock, preparing the barn for winter. There were quiet evenings where he read by lamplight and she sewed, and there were mornings when the scent of her fresh bread filled the house, warming it far beyond the fire in the hearth. But it was not only the work or the comfort of daily rituals that healed her, it was the way Thomas saw her. Not as a shadow, not as a burden, but as his equal. Still, the world outside had not forgotten its cruel tongue. One Sunday, Clara decided to join Thomas at church in town. She hadn't stepped into that wooden chapel in years, afraid of whispers. As they entered, eyes turned. Murmurs rippled through the pews. Clara's breath quickened her old shame, threatening to choke her. "Isn't that her one woman?" whispered. "The spinster left behind." "She's even bigger than I remember," another voice cut. The words stung sharp as thorns. Clara froze, her hand trembling at her side. For an instant, she wanted to run back to the ranch to hide again in the safety of quiet. But then Thomas reached for her hand, strong and steady. He didn't glare at the crowd or hush them with anger. He simply laced his fingers through hers and in front of everyone guided her to the front pew. His voice, low but firm, carried in her ear, "Let them see what I see." And so she lifted her chin. She walked with him, not shrinking, but present, fully holy herself. For the first time, the weight of others' judgment felt smaller than the warmth of one man's hand. By the end of the service, whispers had softened. A few eyes lingered, not with scorn, but with curiosity, perhaps even respect. And when Thomas bowed his head in prayer, Clara dared to whisper her own silent one. "Thank you for letting me live to see this day." That night, as the stars shone like scattered lanterns across the sky, Clara and Thomas sat together on the porch. The valley stretched quiet before them, vast and tender. Thomas broke the silence. "Clara, I can't promise the world will stop its cruelty, but I can promise you'll never face it alone again." Her eyes filled not with sorrow, but with something brighter, hope. She touched his arm, her voice soft, but unwavering. "And I promise I'll stop believing their voices more than my own. I'm done hiding." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and earth like a blessing whispered from the land itself. For the first time in her life, Clara felt not just chosen, but cherished. And in the embrace of that truth, her story, long marred by rejection, found its ending. Or perhaps its beginning. Because sometimes the greatest love stories are not the ones that start in youth, but the ones found after years of waiting, proof that it is never too late to be seen, to be loved, to be priceless. In the end, her story was never about the words they once threw at her, or the laughter that chased her down dusty streets. It was about the quiet courage of holding on, about choosing dignity when the world tried to strip it away, and about discovering that love does not ask for perfection, it asks only for truth. When he reached for her hand, not with pity but with certainty, she understood something many spend a lifetime seeking, that being enough was never the question. She had always been enough. What changed was finally finding someone who could see it, and perhaps that's a lesson for us all. No matter how many seasons we've weathered, no matter what labels the world has pressed upon us, there is still a place for tenderness, for kindness, and yes, for love. Sometimes it arrives late, sometimes in unexpected forms, but it is never too late to be chosen, never too late to choose someone else. As we close this chapter, I invite you to pause and reflect. Where in your own life might you have overlooked the quiet worth of someone, or even yourself? If this story touched your heart, I'd love for you to subscribe to None. Wild West Saga, share it with someone who might need its reminder, and leave a comment below. Tell me, would you like to hear more stories like this or see what happened next? Your voice matters here. And maybe, just maybe, your words will become part of the hope someone else needs tonight.